In the fall of 1998, a mechanic walked into a major hardware chain in Mississauga, Ontario, looking for a simple replacement. He needed a half-inch drive ratchet to finish a suspension job before the first winter freeze. For decades, he knew exactly where to look. He expected to find a familiar wall of forged steel, heavy in the hand, stamped with a name that meant lifetime reliability in Canadian repair bays. But the pegboard was empty of domestic iron. The heavy-duty displays were gone. In their place hung rows of plastic blister packs, holding bright, imported chrome sold under a store-brand label. The price was significantly lower. The steel was thinner. The Canadian presence had vanished completely from the aisle. A decade earlier, that exact retail space had been a fortress of domestic manufacturing. The brands suddenly missing from the pegs had not gone bankrupt. Its steel had not softened. The heavy forging presses in nearby Brampton were still running, still stamping out some of the most exact, indestructible sockets and ratchets ever produced in North America. The paradox was entirely financial. The tool maker was not failing to produce a superior wrench. It was producing a wrench too uncompromising and too expensive for a Canadian retail system that had quietly decided it no longer wanted to sell tools meant to outlive the men who bought them. The tool that built the country had been evicted from its own hardware stores. But the real story of Gray tools in Canada is not merely a retail displacement. It is the story of the widening gap between the indestructible craftsmanship a Canadian workshop demanded and the disposable economics a modern market rewarded. Somewhere in a toolbox, in a factory drawer, in a hardware aisle, there is a stamped handle with a name and a Canadian story behind it. We tell those stories. Subscribe if you want to hear them. The story begins not in an overseas megafactory, but in Canada, in a modest Toronto machine shop in 1912. In 1912, a young machinist named Alex Gray established a small manufacturing operation in Toronto. He did not set out to build an empire of chrome and steel. He began with a practical understanding of metal, producing specialty hardware, machine parts, and eventually hand tools. At the time, the Canadian mechanical landscape was undergoing a violent, rapid transformation. The horse was yielding to the internal combustion engine. The blacksmith's forge was being replaced by the automotive repair bay. But the tools available to Canadian workers had not kept pace with the machines they were expected to fix. Before Gray began forging professional mechanics' tools, the Canadian repair market was defined by compromise, delay, and scraped knuckles. If a farmer in Manitoba needed to repair a tractor, or a mechanic in Hamilton needed to tear down an engine block, they relied largely on heavy, fixed-size, open-end wrenches. These tools were slow. They required the user to remove the wrench from the nut after every partial turn. Worse, as automotive fasteners became smaller and tighter, crude iron wrenches would often slip, rounding off the corners of a bolt and turning a 10-minute adjustment into a half-day extraction. The interchangeable socket, a removable metal cup that fits over a fastener and connects to a ratchet or driver, existed, but the early versions were clumsy and prone to shattering under heavy load. A Canadian mechanic who wanted a truly reliable socket and ratchet set had to look across the border. High-quality American imported sets existed, but they faced steep import duties, making them punishingly expensive for the average Canadian worker. Furthermore, distance created risk. If an imported ratchet mechanism failed, or a socket cracked under the torque of a frozen cylinder head bolt, the mechanic could wait weeks for a replacement part to arrive from Chicago or Kenosha. What the Canadian mechanic lacked was not just a tool. He lacked a domestic lifeline, a high-tolerance tool system forged from superior steel, priced for the Canadian economy, and backed by a local supply chain that could replace a broken drive in a matter of hours. Alex Gray saw the gap between the rising demand for automotive maintenance and the inadequate steel on the benches. By the 1920s, Gray tools pivoted aggressively into the production of professional-grade automotive hand tools. They invested heavily in drop forging, a process where heated metal is shaped by heavy dies, striking it into form. They utilized alloy steel mixed with elements such as chromium and vanadium to improve strength, toughness, and wear resistance. Gray realized that a ratchet used in a heated American factory lived a very different life than a ratchet used to break loose suspension bolts on a frozen dirt floor in northern Ontario. The Canadian tool had to be overbuilt. The true Canadian entry, the moment Gray moved from a local manufacturer to a national mechanical necessity, occurred as the company formalized its automotive tool lines for regional hardware wholesalers and auto parts jobbers. Records suggest that by 1928, a mechanic could purchase a comprehensive Gray socket and ratchet set from regional distributors like Cochrane Dunlop Hardware for approximately $14.50, roughly $250 in today's money. It was a significant investment for a working man earning perhaps $25 a week, but in a trade where time was income, the ability to rapidly turn fasteners without stripping them was a mandatory upgrade. The early Canadian reception was driven by the trade itself. Mechanics realized that the Toronto forged steel could take immense punishment without spreading or snapping. In 1930, the trade press of the period, including publications like Canadian Automotive Trade, began noting the importance of domestic manufacturers who understood the specific, harsh requirements of the northern repair sector. Gray was no longer just an alternative to imported tools, it was becoming the standard. The industrial triggers accelerated rapidly. As Canada entered the Second World War, the demand for reliable domestic mechanical tools skyrocketed. The military needed wrenches, sockets, and ratchets to maintain tanks, aircraft, and transport vehicles. Gray tools secured essential government procurement contracts, putting their stamped steel into the hands of thousands of young mechanics in uniform. By the end of the conflict, the company had transformed. The mechanics who returned from the war, having trusted Gray ratchets to repair heavy vehicles in European mud, demanded the exact same brand when they returned to civilian repair bays in Vancouver, Winnipeg, and Halifax. By 1950, industry estimates indicate the company had expanded its reach through hundreds of Canadian dealers, automotive supply houses, and industrial catalogs. The original Toronto footprint eventually gave way to a larger, modern forging plant in Brampton, Ontario. Gray had successfully built the supply chain the country had been missing 3 decades earlier. A broken socket in Calgary no longer meant a 2-week wait for an American replacement. A parts jobber had the Canadian equivalent on the shelf, ready to go. The brand had solved the crisis of the unheated barn and the busy factory floor. The tools were local. The steel was hardened. The mechanics were loyal. To understand how a modest Toronto machine shop captured the Canadian professional repair market, you must physically examine a mid-century Gray socket and ratchet. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of a 1950s garage, these were not mass-market commodities hanging in blister packs. They were precision instruments built for mechanical violence. The socket, a removable metal cup that fits over a fastener and connects to a ratchet or driver, was not cast or cheaply stamped. It was the product of drop forging, a process where heated metal is shaped by heavy dies, striking it into form. This compressed the grain structure of the alloy steel, giving the cylinder immense burst strength. But the defining physical trait of a Gray socket, the feature every mechanic instantly recognized by touch, was the heavy knurl. A knurl, a textured pattern cut into metal to improve grip or adjustability, was machined deeply around the base of the socket body. When a mechanic in a drafty shop had hands slick with motor oil, transmission fluid, and freezing grease, that textured band allowed him to spin a loose nut rapidly by hand before attaching the heavy drive handle. It was a minor manufacturing expense that saved thousands of hours in Canadian repair bays. The engine driving the entire system was the ratchet, a handle with a one-way mechanism that turns a socket without removing it from the fastener each time. While cheaper consumer tools used crude, low-tooth count gears that required wide, sweeping arcs to engage, the Gray design utilized a precision pawel and a fine-tooth gear system. This tighter engagement allowed a worker to turn a hidden bolt in the cramped, dark recess of a truck engine bay, where the handle could only swing a few degrees. The internal components underwent rigorous heat treatment. Controlled heating and cooling used to change the hardness, toughness, and strength of steel. The tolerance, the allowed variation in a tool's dimensions, tight tolerance helps a tool fit a fastener accurately, was absolute. When a half-inch Gray socket snapped onto a half-inch bolt head, there was no slop, there was no rattle. The internal broaching gripped the fastener securely, transferring maximum torque without rounding off the steel corners. Excellence, however, required capital. By 1955, a complete Gray Professional half-inch drive socket set cost approximately $35, roughly $380 in today's money. At that time, a standard hardware store set from a discount mail-order catalog could be bought for roughly half that price. A mechanic earned perhaps $60 to $80 a week. Buying a Gray set meant dedicating nearly half a week's wages to a single red metal box. But in the repair trade, the math was calculated differently. A cheap, imported socket that cracked under load, or a loose ratchet that slipped and rounded off a rusted manifold bolt, did not just break. It cost the mechanic hours of brutal extraction time. It cost the shop a repair bay for the afternoon. It cost the customer their vehicle. In that punishing environment, the premium price of Canadian steel was not a luxury tax. It was cheap insurance. The distribution breakthrough that pushed Gray from a respected regional specialist to a national standard was their aggressive integration into the industrial and automotive supply networks. Gray deliberately bypassed the cheap consumer retail shelves and went directly to where the heavy work was done. They secured catalog listings and shelf space with major industrial suppliers and auto parts networks that service the trades directly. Regional distributors like Acklands in Western Canada, Cochrane Dunlop Hardware in Ontario, Taylor & Pearson in the Prairies, and specialized automotive jobbers in Quebec carried the full inventory. When a mechanic needed a specific deep well socket for a spark plug or a massive breaker bar for a suspension job, the jobber down the street had it in a drawer, ready to hand over the counter. Through this network, the tools rapidly infiltrated the heaviest industrial sites in the country. Mechanics at the massive General Motors assembly plant in Oshawa kept them on their carts to keep the automotive production lines moving. Maintenance crews at the Stelco steel mills in Hamilton relied on the heavy 3/4-inch drive sets to tear down massive rolling equipment. Instructors at the Southern Alberta Institute of Technology in Calgary standardized their training benches with Gray tools, ensuring the next generation of mechanics learned the trade entirely on domestic steel. Across the country, CP Rail maintenance yards stocked the brand in their tool cribs. Farm equipment dealerships in Saskatchewan kept the sets on their service trucks, dragging them through mud, snow, and gravel to repair combines in the field. Competitors struggled to breach the moat Gray had built. An American company could produce a similar high-quality tool, but they faced import tariffs and lacked the immediate local replacement network. A cheap import could severely undercut the price, but it could not survive the sheer mechanical stress of a Canadian winter repair. Gray offered a lethal combination: professional-grade metallurgy, a localized distribution network, and an unspoken guarantee that if the tool broke under normal use, the local dealer would hand over a replacement without an argument. Every drawer, every bench, every repair. The name stamped into the handle was not a country of origin, it was a specification. By the early 1970s, the Brampton forging plant was operating at a scale that redefined the Canadian mechanical landscape. Gray Tools was no longer just a successful manufacturer. It had become the central nervous system of the nation's heavy industries. The post-war economic boom had transformed the country. Highways were expanding, automotive ownership had skyrocketed, and heavy manufacturing was driving the national economy. Every new machine, every new truck, and every new factory line required constant, grueling maintenance. In this environment, the demand for indestructible hand tools was ravenous, and the domestic steel forged in Ontario was positioned perfectly to feed it. The professional ecosystem that depended on the brand was absolute, stretching across every vital sector of the Canadian economy. Mechanics at the massive General Motors assembly plant in Oshawa torqued down engine mounts with Gray sockets. Maintenance crews deep inside the Inco nickel mines in Sudbury relied on the heavy-duty ratchets to keep subterranean extraction equipment running in highly corrosive environments. Heavy-duty mechanics at the sprawling CP rail yards in Winnipeg used the massive 1-inch drive sets to tear down locomotive engines. Automotive instructors at Centennial College in Toronto standardized their apprenticeship benches with the brand, ensuring new mechanics learned the feel of domestic steel on their first day. Diesel mechanics servicing logging trucks in the remote British Columbia interior trusted the ratchets in the freezing mud. Procurement officers for the Canadian Armed Forces Base in Petawawa stocked their military motor pools exclusively with the local tools. The mechanic, the machinist, and the heavy-duty technician all depended on the same stamped steel. This was the defining Canadian cultural moment for the brand, the golden age of the independent repair garage and the factory maintenance crew. In the 1960s and 1970s, a professional mechanic's toolbox was not merely a storage container. It was a rolling resume, a financial investment, and a deeply personal declaration of competence. When a customer walked into an independent repair shop in rural Manitoba or a dealership in downtown Montreal, the sight of a red metal box filled with perfectly organized gray sockets sent a specific message. It communicated that the mechanic took his trade seriously enough to buy the best equipment available. The tools were a language of professional trust. The mechanical reality of the country demanded nothing less. On a frozen cylinder head bolt inside an unheated Saskatchewan service bay in January, where a cheap ratchet gear would shatter and turn a routine engine teardown into a multi-day extraction nightmare, the fine-tooth engagement and forged strength of a Gray ratchet meant the difference between finishing the overhaul by sunset and losing the bay for the week. The mechanics knew the steel would hold. They knew the internal broaching would grip. They knew the tool would not fail before the man did. This absolute trust was reinforced by a service and distribution network that blanketed the vast geography of the country. Gray did not just sell tools, they sold uninterrupted uptime. Through partnerships with massive industrial suppliers like Acklands and hundreds of local automotive parts jobbers, they established a replacement system that functioned as an ironclad guarantee. If a mechanic managed to break a socket using a massive breaker bar, he did not have to mail the pieces to a distant corporate headquarters. He simply drove to the local jobber, tossed the broken steel on the counter, and was handed a brand new replacement from the drawer. No paperwork, no interrogation, no delay. This warranty system built a level of fierce, generational loyalty that no foreign competitor could easily dislodge. A mechanic bought a Gray set knowing it was the last set he would ever be forced to buy. At its peak during this era, industry estimates suggest the Brampton facility was forging millions of individual tools annually. The factory floors vibrated with the rhythmic impact of massive drop forging hammers, transforming raw alloy steel into finished, chrome-plated precision instruments. The company supported a massive catalog of specialized tools, ranging from tiny quarter-inch drive ignition sets used by aviation mechanics to colossal sockets required by the oil field crews in Alberta. They had effectively monopolized the premium professional tier. The brand appeared in national industrial supply catalogs, vocational school training manuals, and the heavy tool cribs of every major municipal works department in the nation. In a market where a mechanic needed reliable replacement before his next shift began, that massive footprint was not just corporate advertising. It was professional survival. Under the buzzing fluorescent lights of a union machine shop or an independent garage, a complete Gray socket set possessed a distinct physical authority. The heavy chrome plating, a thin metal coating used to resist corrosion and create a polished finish, caught the overhead glare, standing out sharply against the black grease and solvent-stained wood of the workbench. When a mechanic picked up the ratchet, the weight was immediately apparent. It did not feel hollow. It felt like a solid bar of calibrated iron. The audible, crisp clicking of the fine-tooth gear mechanism as it spun freely in the hand was the sound of absolute mechanical certainty. The stamped letters, Gray Canada, sunk deep into the handle, were not just a manufacturer's mark. They were a badge of professional arrival. The sheer volume of Canadian industry during this period forced the company to expand its catalog aggressively. As the automotive market began integrating foreign vehicles alongside domestic production, the demand for metric sizing exploded. Gray did not simply import cheap metric alternatives to fill the gap. They forged new dies in Brampton, producing flawless metric sockets to sit alongside their imperial lines. This meant doubling the inventory, doubling the catalog size, and doubling their commitment to domestic manufacturing. Apprentices entering the trade at vocational schools across Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia were handed Gray tool lists as their required baseline. Purchasing a complete imperial and metric set was a monumental financial commitment for a young worker, but it was universally accepted as the mandatory cost of doing serious business. By the dawn of the 1980s, the company's footprint had expanded to its absolute zenith. Gray tools were not merely hidden inside professional toolboxes. They commanded premium shelf space in the highest-tier retail and industrial environments across the country. Specialized hardware wholesalers shipped them to northern mining towns in Quebec. Automotive parts networks distributed them to every corner of the Maritimes. Industrial supply giants like Ackland's featured them prominently in massive, phone book-sized trade catalogs that sat on the purchasing desks of every factory, mill, and municipal garage from Newfoundland to Vancouver Island. Peak estimates of the era indicate the Brampton facility was producing thousands of individual tool lines, supporting a network of over 1,000 authorized Canadian dealers, industrial supply counters, and premium hardware outlets. They were the undisputed king of the Canadian heavy-duty market. Every factory floor, every repair bay, every industrial maintenance crib. The empire was built on a simple, unbreakable premise. Canadian workers would always pay a premium for a tool that refused to fail. They had successfully navigated the post-war industrial boom, expanded their forging capabilities, and secured the unshakable loyalty of the union trades. The mechanic, the factory worker, and the machinist all believed the same thing. The local steel was invincible. But the vulnerability of the empire was never the quality of the forging. The vulnerability was the changing architecture of the Canadian market itself. The company had built a tool designed to last a lifetime, assuming the retail system that sold it would value that longevity forever. They had mastered the mechanics of steel, but a new kind of retail economics was about to rewrite the rules of the Canadian hardware aisle. The Canadian turning point arrived in the late 1980s. Quietly at first, hidden within the purchasing spreadsheets of national retail chains rather than on the factory floor. The decline of Gray tools as a dominant, visible force in the everyday Canadian garage was not a failure of metallurgy. The Brampton plant was still forging some of the finest hand tools on the continent. The crisis was the result of a profound structural shift in how tools were bought, priced, and sold. The company was caught in a merciless vice grip of three converging market pressures: Force 1, Canadian retail, hardware and dealer dominance; Force 3, competition from cheap imports and private labels; and Force 5, steel, labor, warranty, and distribution costs. For decades, the independent Canadian hardware store and the local auto parts jobber had been the primary conduits for mechanics' tools. These businesses valued deep community relationships, knowledgeable counter staff, and tools that did not generate angry returns from local tradesmen. But as the 1980s bled into the 1990s, the Canadian retail landscape consolidated violently. Massive big-box retailers and national chains, most notably the towering presence of Canadian Tire, began to completely dominate the consumer hardware market. These giant corporations operated on an entirely different set of mathematical rules. They did not prioritize generational durability. They prioritized shelf velocity, aesthetic packaging, and, above all, the highest possible profit margin per square foot of retail space. In this new arena, Gray tools faced a fatal, insurmountable cost disadvantage. The Brampton facility was a heavy industrial operation paying fair, unionized Canadian manufacturing wages. The drop forging process consumed immense amounts of electricity. The chrome plating required expensive, highly regulated environmental controls. A high-tolerance alloy steel ratchet forged in Ontario simply could not be manufactured cheaply. When a corporate hardware buyer looked at a procurement ledger, a single Gray half-inch drive ratchet might cost the retailer $50 wholesale, leaving very little room for markup before the retail price became offensive to the weekend consumer. Simultaneously, the global manufacturing market was flooding Canada with polished alternatives. Asian manufacturers, particularly in Taiwan, had vastly improved their metallurgical consistency. They began producing highly polished, acceptable quality socket sets at a fraction of the Canadian manufacturing cost. This ignited Force 3, competition from cheap imports and private labels. A private label, a product made by one manufacturer and sold under another retailer's brand name, became the ultimate weapon for Canadian retail chains. Canadian Tire expanded its Mastercraft line aggressively. Home Hardware pushed its benchmark brand. These retailers realized they could import an entire 100-piece socket set from overseas in a plastic blow-molded case for the exact same wholesale cost as a single Gray professional ratchet forged in Brampton. To the heavy-duty mechanic tearing down a diesel engine in Fort McMurray, the imported steel was still inadequate. The cheap ratchet gears would still strip under extreme torque. But to the suburban homeowner changing spark plugs in a heated Mississauga driveway twice a year, the imported tool was perfectly sufficient. The cheap tool did not need to be indestructible. It only needed to be good enough for the buyer standing in the aisle. Crucially, these national retailers neutralized Gray's greatest historical advantage. They backed their imported private labels with massive, heavily advertised, no questions asked lifetime warranties. If a Mastercraft ratchet broke, the customer simply walked into any Canadian Tire in the country and was handed a new one. The primary advantage of premium domestic steel, the local immediate replacement guarantee that Gray had pioneered, was suddenly matched by every retail customer service desk from Halifax to Victoria. The consumer no longer needed to pay a premium for unbreakable steel when the retailer promised to infinitely replace the breakable steel for free. The displacement on the shelves was systematic and ruthless. Retailers demanded that suppliers drastically lower their prices to compete with the overseas imports. Gray Tools faced an existential choice: cheapen their steel, offshore their forging, compromise their tolerances to meet an artificial retail price point, or abandon the mass consumer market entirely. They refused to compromise the steel. Consequently, the retreat began. The massive consumer hardware catalogs that once featured pages of Gray ratchets began to shrink their domestic offerings, replacing them with high-margin imported kits. Regional, independent hardware chains, unable to compete with the big box flyers, either closed their doors or were absorbed by larger conglomerates, taking their heavy metal Gray display boards down with them. The retail shelves physically changed. The heavy steel tool cabinets were hauled away, replaced by standardized plastic pegboards holding blister-packed imports. By 1995, a profound segregation had occurred in the Canadian tool market. The professional industrial supplier and the mobile tool truck still carried premium brands, but the public retail shelf had been entirely surrendered. A young apprentice looking to build his first toolbox could no longer walk into a local hardware store and handle a Brampton-forged ratchet. The tool had become physically invisible to the general public. The volume dropped. The exposure vanished. The retail connection was broken. The survival of Gray tools through the retail collapse of the 1990s is one of the most paradoxical chapters in Canadian industrial history. Unlike other domestic manufacturers who sold their brand names to foreign conglomerates or filed for bankruptcy, Gray made a brutal, calculated decision. They chose obscurity over compromise. Recognizing that the consumer retail war was lost to cheap offshore steel and big box margin requirements, the company executed a total strategic retreat. They abandoned the suburban garage and retreated entirely behind the chain-link fences of heavy Canadian industry. The displacement in the public sphere was absolute. The gleaming Mastercraft sets claimed the Canadian Tire aisles. Stanley, heavily relying on globalized production, locked down other major hardware chains. Even the surplus and farm markets, once a stronghold for heavy-duty domestic tools, shifted. Stores like Princess Auto began stacking their shelves with their own inexpensive private labels, catering to farmers and independent mechanics who needed a massive socket for a single tractor repair and refused to pay the industrial premium. A Brampton-forged ratchet simply could not compete on a shelf where the primary metric of value was the price tag. Gray pivoted its entire operation toward buyers who still calculated tool costs in downtime rather than purchase price. They navigated Force 2, patent, regulation, and industrial procurement headwinds. They secured strict military specifications. They pursued massive government contracts. They sold directly to the specialized mobile tool trucks that serviced high-end automotive dealerships. They forged heavy-duty strike wrenches for the Alberta oil fields. They maintained their contracts with the aerospace sector, where a shattered socket could cause catastrophic damage to an aircraft turbine. In these environments, the retail price did not matter. The forged strength, the exact tolerance, and the domestic accountability meant everything. But this industrial survival came at an immense cultural cost. By withdrawing into the B2B sector, the brand severed its connection with the everyday Canadian worker. For generations, a young man fixing his first car in an unheated Ontario driveway had aspired to own the same tools his father used in the factory. That generational bridge was burned. The young mechanic could no longer afford, or even find, the domestic standard. A new generation of Canadians learned to twist fasteners using imported steel, conditioned by the retail market to assume that tools were naturally disposable, meant to be broken and exchanged at a bright customer service desk. The physical spaces where the brand had built its reputation were hollowed out. The local auto parts jobber, squeezed by massive national distribution networks, slowly disappeared from the small-town main streets. The heavy red metal gray display boards that once sat proudly on hardware counters in rural Manitoba and British Columbia were quietly dismantled. The warranty desks that had replaced broken drives for 50 years stopped carrying the inventory. The familiar stamped logo faded from the public consciousness. The transition was complete. The local hardware stores closed. The consumer catalogs dropped the line. The red metal displays were scrapped. The retail shelves changed names. The big box chains won the aisle. The everyday garage lost its steel. The public connection was gone. The retail drawer stayed shut. The story of Gray tools in Canada does not end with a padlock on a factory gate or a bankruptcy auction. The brand name was never sold to a foreign conglomerate. The dies were never shipped across the ocean to be used on inferior steel. In a rare exception to the relentless narrative of Canadian industrial collapse, the company survived. Today, the Brampton facility continues to forge professional-grade tools for military, aerospace, and heavy industrial clients. But the empire they once held, the undisputed dominance of the everyday Canadian garage, the presence on every hardware counter, and the cultural position as the default tool for the working tradesman, was entirely dismantled by the retail market. The brand survived, but the Canadian mechanic lost his local standard. In the wake of this retail disappearance, a fervent preservation community emerged across the country. In the secondary markets of Canada, the vintage tools forged during the company's golden age have taken on a mythical status. At swap meets in rural Ontario, in the dusty corners of estate sales in the prairies, and across online machinist forums, collectors and professional mechanics actively hunt for the older, knurled sockets in the heavy fine-tooth ratchets. A complete, mid-century half-inch drive set in its original red metal box, a kit that might have cost $35 in 1955, frequently commands hundreds of dollars today. They are bought by retired factory workers holding onto a piece of their trade, by young apprentices who have realized that cheap imported steel bends under pressure, and by restoration shops that refuse to rebuild classic Canadian automobiles with anything less than period-correct domestic iron. These buyers do not pay premium prices for nostalgia. They pay for physical certainty. The original Brampton-forged steel still matters because the mechanical reality of repair work has not changed. An old scuffed gray half-inch drive ratchet with a heavy knurled socket can still do what a loose, blister-packed bargain copy cannot. When a farmer in Saskatchewan faces a seized, rust-welded suspension bolt on a 20-year-old tractor, the tight tolerance of the vintage Canadian socket will grip the degraded fastener exactly. The forged gear teeth will not shear under the massive torque of a heavy pull. It will turn the bolt without destroying it, not for sentimentality, because the job still begins where hardened steel meets stubborn iron. Today, the physical landscape of the brand's former retail empire is unrecognizable. While the forging presses still hammer away in the industrial parks of Brampton, the community spaces that once connected those tools to the public are gone. The addresses that housed independent hardware stores in Toronto, auto parts jobbers in Montreal, and regional distributors in Winnipeg are now occupied by dollar stores, glass condominiums, or sprawling, brightly lit big-box retail centers. The heavy red metal display boards that stood on those wooden counters have been scrapped, replaced by infinite walls of plastic packaging that promise everything but deliver very little. The localized warranty desks, where a tradesman could look another man in the eye and exchange a broken tool in 2 minutes, have been replaced by automated telephone menus and outsourced return centers. There is a strange, unexpected footnote to the company's withdrawal from the consumer market. Because Gray overbuilt their ratchets to survive the brutal conditions of the mid-century repair trade, The tools effectively outlived the need for the retail warranty networks that once supported them. Across Canada today, there are thousands of mechanics using gray socket sets they inherited from their fathers and grandfathers. These tools have turned millions of fasteners, survived decades of freezing oil-filled mud, and endured countless blows from heavy hammers. They have never been returned to a warranty desk because they simply refuse to break. The toolmaker built a product so indestructible that it rendered its own replacement system unnecessary. The retreat of gray tools from the public shelf reveals a difficult truth about Canadian commercial culture. It exposes the massive gap between what the market claims to value and what it actually rewards. For generations, the Canadian worker demanded craftsmanship, absolute reliability, and a lifetime guarantee. But when the retail architecture shifted toward big box consolidation, those virtues were immediately sacrificed for shelf velocity, lower margins, and overseas outsourcing. The market decided that a tool built to last 50 years was a poor business model compared to a tool that broke and was repurchased every 5. The Canadian garage did not reject the domestic steel. The retail system simply removed the choice. We traded permanence for convenience, and in the process, we lost a way of working. Yet long after the catalogs faded and the hardware aisles surrendered to imported plastic, the steel remains. It is still lying in the bottom drawer of an old wooden workbench in a freezing Ontario garage. Its chrome worn thin by decades of heavy grease, its heavy knurled collar perfectly intact, its old name stamped deep into the handle, still waiting for a freezing hand, a rusted bolt, and one more turn. Every week we tell the stories of the tools that shaped Canadian workshops and what the market eventually did to them. See you in the next one.